Habakkuk and his people had a problem. He wasn't writing this short little book because he was trying to make tenure or trying to raise his social profile or because he was just trying to sell more books. Like other prophets, Habakkuk wrote about a real situation, a situation of pain and the struggles that his people were encountering. It reminds me, as I was thinking about this week, of the old R.E.M. song, and some of us may remember it, Everybody Hurts. It's in a lot of movies. Everybody hurts sometimes. And the reason that song resonated and the reason it keeps getting recycled in movies and in TV shows is because of the universal experience that people have with pain. Everybody does, in fact, hurt. Habakkuk gives a voice to these hurts. In the opening verses of this short book, the prophet cries out to God for help. And now in our reading this week, we pick up in the second part of that cry where God responds. The divine response reveals something good in the darkness. Just as R.E.M. sang a message of hope and support for those who were experiencing pain and despair, God's response is one of hope and support for Habakkuk, his people, and in turn for us here today who read and study these words. When Habakkuk talks about injustice and the oppression they face, God says, be astonished. Be astounded. In other words, God says, I hear you, and I'm going to do something amazing. In fact, you're not going to believe it. And Habakkuk had every reason to not believe it. Habakkuk had every reason to be astonished, to be amazed, because God said, I'm going to use the Chaldeans. Well, that may not mean much to us. But if you were him, you might say, wait, what? I'm sorry, I know I'm praying and I'm prophesying and I'm got this sacred attunement as an Old Testament prophet, so I'm speaking a word of the divine. Yet, what? Did you say the Chaldeans? When we ask God to solve our problems, we often approach it the same way we approached this exercise of problem and solution. We approach it with some idea of what God could, or probably, if we're being more honest, should do. There's a certain decorum. We know what's appropriate. We know how God should come up with this solution. We know how God should work. And there are certain solutions that don't fall into our perception of what God should or could do. When something happens outside of these plans, it can be hard to accept. Think about the worst possible solution to a problem. Okay, if you've got something in your mind, the Chaldeans responding would be worse. They wouldn't make the situation necessarily worse than it was, but it's not ideal. But in this passage, what we see is a God who listens, a God who interacts, a God who is with us. We're not alone. Not only do we have one another, but God is interacting with humanity all the time. When we study somebody like Habakkuk, we see God at work in the lives of real people. We see people who hurt, yet the hurt isn't the end of the story. God hears the hurt and responds differently than they were expecting, differently than their prayers. This isn't to frustrate Habakkuk. It's just as it wasn't to frustrate Job when Job went to God with his complaints. The point is, God has a plan, and our calling is to get on board with God's plan instead of trying to impose our desire on God. And it's so easy to think that we have things figured out, or to think we have an idea of how things should go. But instead, God calls us to obedience. God calls us to faithfulness. God calls us to continue seeking God. If we jump from Habakkuk into the New Testament, especially in the Gospels, we can see what Jesus called people to do. And it's actually pretty simple. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus invited people to follow him. That was the invitation. In John 12:26, Jesus said, "Whoever serves me must follow me." In our own reading today, our gospel lesson, Jesus said, "Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." Our calling is to follow him, and if we do, we don't walk in darkness. The light may not be what we think it should be. It may not conform to our own sense of what things should be, but we would be walking in the light of Christ. In Habakkuk, we enter this time of trouble. Yet our calling is to be faithful to God. That calling doesn't change whether we're looking in the Old Testament or the New. Even if God's solution to our problem isn't what we wanted, we're supposed to follow God's plan, even if it involves the Chaldeans. All right, the Chaldeans were part of ancient Mesopotamia. They were down in the south, and lots of ancient authors wrote about them. Pliny the Elder, Lucretius, Valerius Maximus, they all wrote about the Chaldeans' accomplishments. Especially they were known for astronomy. Yet their support for rebellion against the Assyrians didn't mean instant liberation for the ancient Israelites. It meant that the Assyrians weren't the dominating force anymore. But that would in turn mean that now the Chaldeans were more powerful, still more powerful than the ancient Israelites. And with the Assyrians out of the picture, it sort of left a power vacuum, and the Babylonians were going to be coming in to fill it. There's a contrasting rhetorical pattern between the reading last week in verses 2 to 5 and the reading this week, and 2 to 4 and the reading this week. In verse 3, Habakkuk said to God, "Look and observe." In our reading this week, in verse 5, God responds and says, "No, you look and observe." In verse 4 from last week's reading, Habakkuk said, "There's no justice." But in verse 7, in this week's reading, God responds back to Habakkuk and says, "There's going to be justice." In verses 2 and 3, Habakkuk says, "Look at all the violence, God. Look at what's happening." And in verse 9 of this week's reading, God says back to Habakkuk, "Yeah, there's going to be violence, all right. But the violence is going to be against the baddies." This poetic back and forth invites readers to think about this section, verses 2 to 11, as this one integrated whole. God responds using Habakkuk's complaints, yet God takes this unexpected turn and doesn't provide some vacuous, there, it's all going to be okay, just trust me. Instead, there's this divine redirect and sort of a holy, "Hey Habakkuk, watch this. It's going to be different." The defining characteristic of the prophetic tradition was the end of the long resented Assyrian Empire. The ancient Israelites had plenty of problems, but one of the biggest problems they faced was this foreign invader, the Assyrians. The prophet Nahum celebrated their fall. Habakkuk comes after Nahum, and Habakkuk, instead of looking at their fall, offers more of a cry to God for help. And each of the prophets help us see how we can live and interact with God as we face our problems. It doesn't matter how big or small they are, whether problems involve nations, wars, or monopolize the news cycle, or the problems are personal and private and something we hold dear. We can take whatever we face, whatever we carry, whatever we have as our problems to God. The prophets help us see how we can be honest and live in faith and live in the faith that God is interacting and watching. They tell us to keep calling out even when we're not sure where our prayers go. They tell us to keep calling out even when we feel like our prayers don't go any farther than the ceiling. Keep praying, keep calling out, keep following God. A book like Habakkuk can sometimes feel hard, distant. We start naming Assyria, Chaldea, Babylon, and ancient Israel, and it feels out of touch. We even, because we study Habakkuk so rarely, often try to figure out how Habakkuk. The point is to talk about it. It doesn't matter how you say it. The point is to read it and interact with it. But the thing is, it's not distant. Right this second, the former Persian Empire, modern-day Iran, is facing an existential crisis. The former Austro-Hungarian Empire, modern-day Hungary, recently voted out their dictatorial leader. The old Ottoman Empire, current Turkey, is stirring. It's funny as you think about all these ancient names, Babylon, Assyria, and then you look at the world today. It's the kind of thing that led Alphonse Kerr to write, the more things change, the more they continue to be the same. Habakkuk only sounds distant when we read it at a surface level and don't take it seriously and don't ask the questions about how to live it out, how to take it and apply it to our lives. The message is, yes, there are problems. There always have been. And there, in some form or fashion, always will be. But throughout all the problems, through every up and down life gives us, God is present. God is listening. God is here with us, and God cares about you. God's instrument of justice might be different than we anticipated. God might do things in a way that we didn't expect. God might even use the Chaldeans to solve our problem. But we don't know what's ahead. We don't know what's coming. We don't know how the story's going to unfold. We don't know what's next. We only know that God is God. God has a plan for the future. And when we face problems, it's easy to get caught up in finding solutions and then telling God what to do about them. But instead, we can move forward in faith. We don't know God's plans. Our calling is to live in faith. Keep engaging, keep praying, keep working for what's good, keep volunteering, keep responding, keep communicating, keep doing all of the things that God calls us to do, and keep moving forward throughout every up and down. When we face problems, first and foremost, our calling is to be obedient and follow God. Amen.